Gentlemen, let's get to the meat. And the meat of today's episode is a little bit about encryption. Now, we did make a big kerfuffle not too long ago because encryption was heavy in the news. And the San Bernadino shooting really sort of brought out the worst in fear-mongering. We had law enforcement agencies basically saying we need access to encrypted devices. We need to be able to force these companies to either backdoor their encryption or to work with us to break the encryption that they've created to protect their customers. You do remember that after the San Bernardino shooting, the FBI evoked the All Writs Act, which dates back to 1789, before digital computers were even a fantasy, to compel Apple to break their own encryption. And the DOJ agreed with them. It came after Apple, and all the major tech giants rallied around the Cupertino headquarters to show that, look, encryption, we understand, may be difficult for law enforcement, but it's not acceptable to just disable it, get rid of it, or pretend like it doesn't exist. Cheebert, let's talk a little bit about this backstory. It's very easy for people to forget the importance of this issue because it's no longer in the headlines. It's no longer really pushing the news. But when this was happening, there were some major conversations about what we expect out of privacy in the digital world. What would you say would be the thing that sort of shut the conversation down? Because people rarely talk about this anymore.
I think one of the big issues is encryption. It's either working or it doesn't. And if you disable it or you weaken it, all of a sudden, it's not even worth having. So one of the elephant in the room actually for encryption is one thing that we actually talked about. And it's a lot of these people that do really good encryption systems are saying, well, if the Department of Justice is going to play this game, we're going to take it offshore. And that's exactly what's starting to happen. And a lot of the people are finally realizing that, hey, just because the gun was pointed at Apple doesn't mean that I'm not going to hit by the backscatter. Encryption needs to stay strong. And I'm sorry, DOJ, but, you're opening a Pandora's box. Live with the results.
Yeah. And that's what some of the more level heads were saying. They were saying, look, we want to help. Obviously, this is an instance in which law enforcement, with a proper warrant that has gone through the courts, should be able to access the information on this phone if it is involved in an active investigation. But the same people who were saying that were saying, we can't give you carte blanche. We can't just give you a skeleton key, and we can't be an arm of the law. If you remember the Feinstein-Burr bill, that's essentially what it would have done. It would have deputized tech companies and said, you must participate in any effort to break the encryption that you've created. And it was a nightmare scenario of unintended consequences. Now, we've seen that bill get buried, even though it got a lot of support, and it had a lot of homegrown grassroots support when it first came out. It sort of died out of the news, and not even Dianne Feinstein or Richard Burr, who were the bipartisan group from the Intelligence Committee who first proposed the bill, will talk about it. Curtis, why do you think that is? Why was it that you had so many different law enforcement and legislative entities putting capital into pushing forward these bills, and then they were just willing to let it go?
I think to a certain extent, the law enforcement push was one where there were law enforcement agents who saw an opening. They felt like the mood was right to go ahead and get the keys that they've wanted for some time. I mean, let's face it, what law enforcement really wants is the ability to easily do their job. Because when they don't have the keys, when they aren't able to do their job, then we have a zero tolerance toward law enforcement failing to protect us from something going wrong. Now, the bill that was proposed was of a similar type to a lot of the bills we've seen in Congress for roughly the last 16 years. That's where something happens, and the response is one that would give more power to law enforcement and intelligence communities with the basic argument that it's an either-or game. We're playing in a zero-sum world where if we want privacy, we must accept that it means that the terrorists and criminals are going to be able to do whatever they want. And if we want to be safe, then we really need to get over this silly notion of privacy. And oh, by the way, if you're not doing anything wrong, then what are you worried about? Well, with the passage of a little bit of time, the political scene changed. The pushback began. A lot of the people who had thought there was going to be a very rapid acquiescence to greater scrutiny realized that it wasn't going to happen, so they pulled back. It's all a purely political calculation. When the political winds changed, well, so did the response of the politicians.